Arthur Ace Grayson, 95 years old, and had seen it all: wars, loss, and victories. Living in solitude, the old war hero thought his battles were long over. But when a gang of ruthless outlaws targeted him in the dead of night, they made the mistake of underestimating his resilience. What they didn't expect was that one phone call would change everything and leave them terrified. This is a story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable will of a veteran who refused to back down. Arthur Ace Grayson lived a life of quiet dignity in his modest, weathered home on the outskirts of Stony Ridge, a town where little ever happened. His house, a testament to decades of memories, was lined with framed photographs of a younger man in uniform, standing proudly with his platoon. The medals on the mantelpiece glimmered faintly in the moonlight, reminders of a past steeped in bravery and sacrifice. At 95, Arthur's days were mostly spent in the calm monotony of routine: coffee at dawn, reading the local paper, and sitting by the window to watch the world pass by. But that evening, the world didn't pass by. It barged in. The first sign of trouble was the sound of engines, deep, guttural roars that echoed across the empty plains surrounding his property. Arthur frowned, setting his coffee cup down as he shuffled to the window. What he saw made his stomach tighten. A group of menacing bikers, their faces obscured by helmets and shadows, rolled into his driveway. Their leader, a tall figure with a leather vest and a cold, calculating demeanor, stepped off his bike. "Razor McCoy," Arthur muttered under his breath. He recognized the man from the stories in the local news, a notorious outlaw who had been wreaking havoc across neighboring towns. Razor and his gang had a reputation for targeting the vulnerable, and tonight their sights were set on Arthur. The gang wasted no time. They began circling his home, shouting crude taunts and revving their engines. One of them threw a beer bottle at the front porch, the glass shattering against the wood. Another yanked down the American flag that Arthur had proudly raised every morning. Inside, Arthur felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. That flag wasn't just a piece of fabric to him. It was a symbol of everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed. His hands clenched into fists, the calluses of a soldier's life still evident despite his age. But this wasn't a battlefield, and he wasn't the young man he used to be. Arthur's joints ached with every step as he moved to lock the doors and windows. The phone sat on the kitchen counter, an old rotary model he hadn't used much in years. His mind raced as he considered his options. Calling the local sheriff wasn't going to help. Stony Ridge had a tiny police force, and by the time they arrived, the damage would already be done. No, this required something different, something decisive. As he stood there, hand hovering over the phone, memories flooded his mind. Flashes of combat zones, of barking orders, of making split-second decisions that meant life or death. Those instincts, dulled but not forgotten, stirred within him. Arthur dialed a number he hadn't used in decades. It was a direct line to an old comrade in arms, a man he hadn't spoken to since his military days. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "This is Ace. I need a favor," Arthur said, his tone firm despite the tremor in his hand. Outside, Razor approached the front door. He knocked twice, the sound reverberating through the house. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice mocking. "Why don't you let us in? We just want to chat." Arthur didn't answer. He stood in the center of his living room, staring at the shattered window and the mess outside. His grip on the phone tightened. "What's the situation?" the voice on the other end asked. "Outlaws," Arthur replied simply. "5 of them, armed, and they've got no idea who they're messing with." The man on the line chuckled, a sound that carried both amusement and respect. "Understood. Help's on the way." Arthur hung up and exhaled deeply. The knock came again, louder this time. Razor's silhouette loomed in the frosted glass of the door, his patience clearly wearing thin. Arthur walked to the fireplace and reached behind a loose brick, pulling out a weathered box. Inside was his service pistol, meticulously cleaned and ready, even after all these years. The chapter ends with Arthur standing in the middle of his home, weapon in hand, as the gang outside grows restless. Razor's voice echoes one last time. "Open the door, old man, or we'll do it for you." Arthur's eyes narrow. "Not tonight," he he mutters as he prepares for what's to come. The air outside crackled with tension, the gang's restlessness echoing in every stomp and murmur. Razor McCoy stood at the forefront, his boot tapping impatiently against the wooden step of Arthur's porch. His gang lingered behind him, their laughter low and menacing, the kind of sound that could send shivers down the spine of even the bravest soul. But Arthur Grayson wasn't just anyone. Inside, Arthur crouched low behind his living room sofa, his service pistol balanced carefully in his weathered hands. His breathing was steady, a testament to years of discipline and survival instincts honed on the battlefield. He peeked out through the broken window, assessing the situation. 5 men. Razor carried a crowbar, another outlaw had a baseball bat, and the others appeared armed with pocket knives and an attitude of invincibility. Arthur knew better than to underestimate them. Razor's reputation wasn't built on empty threats. This was a man who thrived on chaos, a predator who smelled fear and exploited it. The knocking turned to pounding, the door rattling under Razor's force. "You've got one last chance, old man," he shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "Open this door, or we'll tear this place apart." Arthur didn't respond. Instead, he glanced at the clock on the wall. It had been exactly 7 minutes since his call for backup. He calculated it would take another 10, maybe 15, before help arrived. He needed to hold his ground. The gang wasn't known for patience. Razor gave a nod to one of his men, a wiry outlaw with a shaved head and a sneer permanently etched on his face. The man moved to the side of the house, pulling out a small canister of spray paint. Arthur heard the hiss of paint against wood as vulgar graffiti began to decorate his walls. "Come on out, Grandpa," another voice called. "We're just here to party." The gang erupted in laughter, their taunts growing louder. Arthur felt his grip tighten on the pistol. Memories of his younger days flooded back, storming enemy lines, defending his comrades, facing odds that seemed impossible. Those battles had defined him, and now, even at 95, the fire in his soul hadn't been extinguished. But this wasn't just about him. It was about protecting his home, his legacy, and everything he stood for. He wasn't going to let these outlaws strip away his dignity. Outside, Razor signaled to the man with the crowbar. The outlaw approached the window, raising the weapon to smash through the remaining glass. Arthur's eyes narrowed as he steadied his aim. "Don't do it," Arthur called out, his voice firm and unwavering. The man froze mid-swing, startled by the sound of authority in Arthur's tone. For a moment, the gang hesitated, exchanging glances. They weren't used to their targets fighting back. Razor laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "What are you gonna do, old man? Call the cops? You think they're gonna save you?" Arthur didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he took a deliberate step forward, making his presence known. In the dim light of the living room, his silhouette was sharp and commanding, a reminder that this was a man who had faced death and lived to tell the tale. The gang's laughter faltered. Razor's eyes narrowed as he studied Arthur, sensing the steel behind his calm exterior. "You think you're tough, huh?" he sneered. "Well, let's see how tough you are when we come in." Arthur took another step forward, the pistol now visible in his hand. "You've got 5 seconds to leave my property," he said evenly. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken challenges. The gang, emboldened by their numbers, didn't retreat. Instead, Razor raised his crowbar, a signal to move forward. Arthur exhaled slowly. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he wasn't ready to pull it, not yet. He fired a warning shot into the ground, the sharp crack of the bullet reverberating through the night. The gang flinched, momentarily stunned. "You crazy old fool," one of them shouted. Razor's expression darkened, his bravado flickering. "You just made a big mistake," he growled, stepping closer. Arthur didn't back down. "The only mistake here is yours," he replied. "This is your last warning." Before Razor could respond, the distant sound of approaching engines pierced the night. Arthur's reinforcements had arrived. The headlights of 2 trucks illuminated the driveway, and from them stepped 3 men, each one as seasoned and battle-worn as Arthur himself. "Looks like you've got company," Arthur said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The chapter ends with Razor turning to face the newcomers, his confidence visibly shaken as the odds suddenly shift. The headlights from the 2 trucks cut through the darkness, illuminating Razor and his gang in a cold, unforgiving glare. Arthur's reinforcements stepped out one by one, their silhouettes framed against the bright beams. These men weren't ordinary civilians. They were Arthur's brothers in arms, veterans who had shared the same trenches, endured the same battles, and forged unbreakable bonds through fire and blood. Leading the group was John Bull Hendricks, a towering man with a barrel chest and a voice that commanded attention. Behind him were Mike Sparky Reynolds, a wiry man with quick reflexes, and Pete Doc Carter, the medic whose calm demeanor had saved countless lives. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, even in their later years. Razor's bravado flickered, his gang shifting uneasily as they realized the situation had changed. "Looks like Grandpa called in the cavalry," one of the outlaws muttered nervously. Bull stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. "This is private property," he said, his voice low and firm. "You've got two choices. Leave now, or regret staying." Razor sneered, his crowbar still gripped tightly. "You think a bunch of old men are going to scare us off?" he said, trying to mask his unease. Bull didn't flinch. He reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out a wooden bat, slinging it over his shoulder with practiced ease. Sparky and Doc followed suit, each armed with tools that carried the weight of their experience and resolve. "You don't know who you're messing with," Sparky said, his tone sharp. "We've seen worse than you, and we're still here. Think about that." Arthur, still standing at his doorway with his pistol in hand, watched the standoff unfold. He felt a surge of pride seeing his comrades once again by his side, their presence a testament to the bond they'd forged over decades. Razor took a step back, his eyes darting between the veterans and his own men. "We're not scared of you," he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. "Then prove it," Bull said, stepping closer. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Razor barked an order, and his gang charged forward. What followed was chaos, a clash of wills and skill, with Arthur's team holding their ground against the outlaws. Sparky was the first to act, using his agility to sidestep an attacker and disarm him with a well-placed blow to the wrist. Bull swung his bat with calculated precision, knocking another outlaw off balance and sending him sprawling into the dirt. Doc, despite his role as a medic, fought with the calm efficiency of someone who understood anatomy all too well, delivering blows designed to incapacitate without causing permanent harm. Inside the house, Arthur kept his focus on the situation. His pistol remained steady as he scanned the yard, ready to intervene if necessary. He knew his comrades could handle themselves, but he also understood the unpredictability of desperate men. Razor, seeing his gang falter, let out a furious growl and charged toward Bull with his crowbar raised. Bull met him head-on, using his bat to deflect the strike before delivering a swift kick to Razor's midsection. The outlaw stumbled, but didn't fall, his anger driving him to press the attack. Arthur stepped out onto the porch, his voice cutting through the chaos. "That's enough!" he shouted, his tone carrying the authority of a seasoned commander. Everyone froze, the silence punctuated only by the labored breathing of the combatants. Arthur raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Razor. "You're outnumbered and outmatched," he said evenly. "Walk away while you still can." Razor hesitated, his grip on the crowbar tightening as he weighed his options. His gang, battered and demoralized, looked to him for direction. For the first time that night, the invincible facade he had carefully constructed began to crack. "You think you've won?" Razor said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "This isn't over." "It is if you're smart," Arthur replied. "Leave now, and you might walk away from this with your pride intact. Stay, and you'll lose more than that." The other outlaws began to retreat, their courage drained by the unwavering resolve of the veterans. Razor, sensing the shift, cursed under his breath and threw his crowbar to the ground. "This isn't the end," he said, his eyes locking onto Arthur's with a promise of vengeance. Arthur didn't waver. "We'll be ready," he said simply. The gang mounted their bikes and roared off into the night, their departure marked by the fading growl of engines. Arthur and his team watched until the taillights disappeared into the darkness. Bull let out a low whistle, resting his bat against his shoulder. "Well, that was fun," he said, a hint of a grin breaking through his serious demeanor. "Fun's not over yet," Arthur replied, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. They'll be back, and next time, they won't underestimate us. The chapter ends with Arthur and his comrades standing together, the knight's victory tempered by the knowledge that the battle is far from over. The night settled into an uneasy calm after the gang's retreat. Arthur and his comrades stood in the dim light of the porch, their shadows stretching across the yard like echoes of battles past. The air was heavy with the scent of dirt, sweat, and tension. Though victorious for the moment, Arthur knew the storm was far from over. Inside the house, the group gathered around Arthur's modest kitchen table. It was a stark contrast to the battleground outside, a space marked by quiet dignity and decades of stories. Bull sat at one end, his bat resting against the wall, while Sparky and Doc leaned back in their chairs, their faces marked by a mix of exhaustion and determination. Arthur poured coffee from an old metal pot, his movements steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. As the mugs were passed around, the group began to strategize. "They'll be back," Arthur said, his voice calm but resolute. "Razor's not the type to take this lying down. He'll come harder next time. More men, better prepared." Bull nodded, his hands wrapped around the steaming mug. "He'll want to save face. People like him can't stand the idea of looking weak." "So what's the plan?" Sparky asked, his quick eyes darting between the group. "We can't just sit around waiting for them to show up." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through possibilities. This wasn't the first time he'd faced an enemy with overwhelming odds, but now the stakes were personal. His home, his legacy, and his comrades were on the line. "We turn their advantage into a weakness," Arthur said after a moment. "They're overconfident. They think we're old, outmatched. We use that to catch them off guard." Doc raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. "What do you have in mind?" Arthur stood and walked to a cabinet near the sink. He opened it to reveal a collection of items, tools, wires, old radio equipment, relics of a life spent improvising solutions under pressure. "We set traps," he said, placing the items on the table. "We make this place a fortress. If they come back, they won't know what hit them." Sparky's face lit up with a grin. "Now we're talking," he said, already reaching for the equipment. The group spent the next few hours sketching out a plan. Bull focused on fortifying the exterior, reinforcing doors and windows with planks and metal sheets. Sparky, ever resourceful, began rigging makeshift alarms and deterrents, cans tied to tripwires, floodlights wired to old car batteries. Doc prepared a first aid station, knowing full well the risks they were about to take. Arthur, meanwhile, dug into his memories, recalling every lesson he'd learned about guerrilla warfare. He thought about the outlaws' tendencies, their arrogance, and how best to exploit it. His hands moved with purpose as he assembled devices, his mind sharper than ever despite his age. As dawn broke, the house and its surroundings had transformed into a formidable stronghold. Every door, every window, every path to the property was a potential trap for anyone foolish enough to invade. The group took a moment to admire their work, a quiet sense of accomplishment settling over them. But Arthur's mind was already elsewhere. He knew their defenses were strong, but there was another battle he needed to fight, one within himself. As the others rested, Arthur stepped outside to the porch, his thoughts heavy. The rising sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and orange, a stark contrast to the dark uncertainty that lay ahead. He stared at the flagpole, now repaired and standing tall, the American flag fluttering gently in the breeze. For a moment, he let himself feel the weight of everything, his age, his memories, the loss of comrades who couldn't be here with him now. He thought about the men he had buried, the lives he had saved, and the battles that had left scars no one could see. Doc joined him quietly, his footsteps soft on the wooden planks. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, leaning against the railing. Arthur shook his head. "Too much to think about." Doc nodded, his gaze fixed on the flag. "You've carried a lot on your shoulders, Ace. More than most men could bear." Arthur sighed, his voice low. "I just don't want to let anyone down. Not now. Not after everything." "You won't," Doc said firmly. "We've got your back. Always have. Always will." The two men stood in silence for a while, the bond between them stronger than words could express. Later that day, the group gathered again, their resolve renewed. They practiced maneuvers, tested their defenses, and prepared for every possible scenario. Arthur could see the determination in their eyes, a reflection of the same fire that burned within him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Arthur felt a sense of calm settle over him. He knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt alive, ready to fight for everything he held dear. The chapter ends with Razor and his gang appearing on the horizon, their motorcycles cutting through the silence of the night. The sound grows louder, a promise of the storm to come. Arthur stands at the ready, his comrades by his side, prepared to face whatever comes next. The low rumble of motorcycles grew louder, vibrating through the night like an oncoming storm. Arthur and his comrades stood ready, their gazes fixed on the dark horizon. The outlaws were returning, just as he had predicted. This time, the stakes were higher, and Arthur could feel it in the cold night air. The motorcycles came into view, headlights cutting through the darkness. Razor led the pack, his expression even more menacing than before. Behind him, twice as many riders followed, their numbers a clear escalation. It was no longer a simple act of revenge for Razor. It was about power, control, and dominance. Inside the house, the makeshift defenses were ready. Sparky crouched by a window, monitoring the tripwires and alarms he had set. Bull stood near the front door, his bat resting on his shoulder like a trusted companion. Doc checked his first aid supplies one last time, his calm demeanor masking the tension in his movements. Arthur stood in the center of the living room, his pistol holstered but within easy reach. His eyes were sharp, his mind focused. He had faced overwhelming odds before, and he would do it again. As Razor's gang dismounted their bikes and spread out across the yard, the leader raised a hand, signaling his men to stop. The air was thick with tension, a standoff waiting to explode. Razor's voice broke the silence, low and dripping with venom. "You had your fun, old man," he said, stepping forward. "But you made a big mistake thinking you could scare us off. Now we're here to show you what happens when you mess with us." Arthur stepped out onto the porch, his silhouette framed by the light spilling from the house. He met Razor's gaze with unwavering calm. "You picked the wrong fight, Razor," he said. "This isn't your turf, and it sure as hell isn't your night." Razor laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Brave words for a man who's outnumbered. Arthur allowed himself a small smile. Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched. Razor's expression darkened, and he motioned for two of his men to advance. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the property. The first tripwire snapped as one of them stepped onto it, triggering a cascade of empty cans that clattered loudly, breaking the silence. Startled, the man jumped back, his hand instinctively reaching for his knife. The second outlaw wasn't as lucky. As he approached the porch, Sparky activated a floodlight, momentarily blinding him. He stumbled, cursing loudly, and Arthur used the distraction to fire a warning shot into the ground near his feet. "Next one won't miss," Arthur called out, his voice steady. The gang hesitated, their confidence faltering as the veteran's preparations became evident. Razor clenched his jaw, his anger mounting. He motioned for the rest of his men to spread out, determined to overwhelm the defenses. But Arthur had anticipated this. As the outlaws moved toward the house, a sudden explosion of noise erupted from the side yard, an old car alarm rigged by Sparky to sound like a siren. The noise startled the gang, forcing them to regroup. Bull took advantage of the chaos, stepping out from behind a corner and swinging his bat with precision. One outlaw went down, clutching his leg and yelling in pain. Inside the house, Doc watched the chaos unfold through a window. His eyes narrowed as he spotted something unusual, a man in the distance, standing apart from the gang. He wasn't armed or wearing the gang's colors. Instead, he was dressed in plain clothes, holding what appeared to be a notebook. "Arthur," Doc called, motioning for him to look. "There's someone else here." Arthur moved to the window, his eyes narrowing as he studied the figure. Something about the man's posture and calm demeanor sent a chill down his spine. He wasn't just an observer. He was watching, studying, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "Who is he?" Sparky asked, glancing over. Arthur shook his head. "I don't know, but he's not with them." Razor noticed the shift in Arthur's attention and turned to see the figure standing at the edge of the property. His eyes widened, and for the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. What the hell is he doing here? Razor muttered under his breath. Arthur caught the reaction and stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night. You know him, Razor? The gang leader hesitated, his bravado slipping. That's none of your business, he snapped. Though his tone betrayed his unease, Arthur pressed on. He doesn't look like one of yours. So why's he here? The figure finally moved, stepping into the dim light. His face was partially obscured, but his presence radiated authority. He spoke for the first time, his voice calm and deliberate. I'm here to ensure the balance is maintained. Arthur's blood ran cold at the cryptic statement. What balance? He asked, his instincts screaming that this man was no ordinary observer. The figure's gaze swept over the yard, taking in the scene of chaos and tension. Razor's debts are my concern, he said. But you've made this more complicated. Arthur realized this man wasn't just connected to Razor. He was someone who held power over him, a hidden force behind the gang's actions, and perhaps even more dangerous than Razor himself. The chapter ends with the mysterious figure turning to Razor. You'll handle this, he said quietly. Or I will. Razor's face paled, and for the first time that night, Arthur saw true fear in his enemy's eyes. The yard fell silent. The mysterious figure's words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Razor turned to face him, his bravado crumbling under the weight of fear. Arthur, watching closely, could sense that the balance of power had shifted. Whoever this man was, he held Razor's leash, and was now tugging it hard. Fine, Razor spat, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound defiant. We'll settle this, but on my terms. The figure tilted his head, his expression calm but cold. Your terms mean nothing to me, he said. Clean this up, Razor. No loose ends. Arthur stepped forward, his pistol still in hand. His eyes were locked on the stranger. Who are you? He demanded, his voice steady but sharp. The man turned his gaze to Arthur, studying him with the detached interest of someone examining a chessboard. My name is unimportant, he said. What matters is that Razor and his gang owe me, and I don't tolerate failure. Razor clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. We don't need your help, he growled. I've got this under control. The figure raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. You're losing to a 95-year-old man and his friends, he said bluntly. That doesn't scream control. Sparky, who had been crouched by the window inside, smirked at the comment. Looks like even his boss thinks he's a joke, he whispered to Bull, who chuckled quietly. The tension snapped as Razor turned back to his gang, barking orders. Surround the house. We're ending this now. The gang sprang into action, their movements chaotic but determined. Arthur and his team prepared for the onslaught. Sparky triggered another alarm, flooding the yard with blinding light and disorienting the outlaws. Bull stepped outside, his bat swinging with precise, calculated force, keeping the attackers at bay. Doc, stationed near the back of the house, intercepted two gang members trying to sneak in through a side door. With quick, practiced movements, he disarmed one and knocked the other unconscious with a well-placed strike. Arthur, meanwhile, stayed on the porch, his sharp eyes scanning the chaos for Razor. He knew the gang leader wouldn't stay on the sidelines for long. Sure enough, Razor emerged from the shadows, gripping a crowbar and heading straight for Arthur. You think you're some kind of hero? Razor shouted, his voice filled with fury. You don't know who you're messing with. Arthur didn't flinch. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A coward who preys on the weak. Razor roared and charged forward, swinging the crowbar with reckless abandon. Arthur sidestepped the attack, his movements slower than they once were, but still precise. He aimed his pistol at Razor, the barrel steady. Drop it, Arthur commanded, his voice like steel. For a moment, Razor hesitated. The confidence that had fueled him all night faltered under Arthur's unwavering gaze. But then he snarled, swinging the crowbar again. This time, Arthur didn't wait. He fired a shot into the ground near Razor's feet, the sharp crack of the bullet stopping him in his tracks. You've already lost, Arthur said, his tone calm but firm. Walk away while you still can. Across the yard, the mysterious figure watched the confrontation unfold. His expression remained unreadable, but there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes. He stepped closer, his presence commanding attention. "This ends now," the figure said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. He addressed Razor directly. "You've proven yourself incapable of handling this. Leave, before you make it worse." Razor's face contorted with anger and humiliation, but he knew he was beaten. He threw the crowbar to the ground and barked an order to his gang. "We're done here. Let's go." The gang, battered and demoralized, began retreating to their motorcycles. Razor shot Arthur a final glare, his eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over, old man," he said through gritted teeth. Arthur didn't respond. He simply watched as the gang rode off into the night, their engines fading into the distance. As the dust settled, the mysterious figure turned to Arthur. "You handled yourself well," he said, his tone almost respectful. "But be warned, Razor may be gone for now, but men like him never disappear completely." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "And what about you? What's your role in all this?" The figure gave a faint smile. "I ensure balance," he said cryptically. And tonight, balance was restored. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. Inside the house, Arthur and his comrades regrouped. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a heavy exhaustion. Bull leaned against the wall, his bat resting by his side. Sparky sat at the kitchen table, inspecting a scrape on his arm. Doc quietly packed up his first aid supplies, his movements deliberate and precise. Arthur stood in the doorway, staring out into the night. His thoughts were a whirlwind: relief, pride, and the lingering unease of knowing this battle wasn't truly over. "You did good tonight, Ace," Bull said, breaking the silence. "Better than good." Arthur turned to his friend, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We all did." The chapter ends with Arthur stepping out onto the porch, the stars shining brightly overhead. He knew the fight wasn't finished, but for now he allowed himself a moment of peace. The early morning air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of dew and earth freshly disturbed by the night's chaos. The faint hum of insects was the only sound, a sharp contrast to the roar of motorcycles and clamor of conflict that had filled the night. Arthur Ace Grayson stood on his porch, his shoulders square and his eyes fixed on the horizon. For the first time in years, he felt something he thought he'd lost, a sense of purpose. Inside the house, his comrades began the slow process of recovery and reflection. Bull sat at the kitchen table, a fresh mug of coffee in his hand, his bat propped against the wall like a soldier at rest. Sparky crouched near the door, inspecting the tripwires and traps they had set, murmuring to himself about improvements he could make. Doc, ever the methodical medic, cleaned and organized the first aid kit, ensuring they were ready for anything that might come next. Arthur joined them, his boots echoing softly against the wooden floor. "We held them off," he said simply, his voice steady. "That's no small thing." Bull looked up, a grin breaking through his weathered face. "Damn right we did. They thought we were easy pickings. Guess we showed them otherwise." Sparky laughed, his quick wit returning. "I don't think Razor will be sending us a Christmas card anytime soon." The group chuckled, the tension of the night easing just a bit, but Arthur's expression remained serious. "This isn't over," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "Razor will regroup, and he'll come back stronger. We need to be ready." The day passed slowly, the weight of the night's events lingering in the air. Arthur spent the morning repairing what he could, patching up windows, resetting traps, and assessing the damage. His movements were deliberate, his mind sharp despite the ache in his joints. He had been through worse, and he wasn't about to let a gang of outlaws break him. As the sun climbed higher, Bull joined him on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to Arthur, who accepted it with a nod of thanks. "You've been quiet," Bull said, leaning against the railing. Arthur sipped his coffee, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Just thinking." "About?" Arthur hesitated, then spoke. "About what it means to fight at my age. About what we're really protecting here." Bull nodded, understanding. "It's not just the house, is it?" "No," Arthur said, his voice steady. It's everything this place stands for. The sacrifices we made, the lives we lived. If we give up now, what was it all for? Bull placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, his grip firm. We're not giving up, Ace. Not now. Not ever. By late afternoon, the group gathered again to discuss their next steps. Sparky laid out a blueprint of the property, pointing out weak spots in their defenses. Doc suggested creating an emergency escape plan, just in case. Bull offered to contact other veterans in the area who might be willing to help. Arthur listened, his mind racing. He felt a surge of gratitude for his comrades, men who had stood by him through thick and thin, who had shown up when he needed them most. He knew they were fighting for more than just him. They were fighting for each other, for the bonds they had forged in fire and blood. As the discussion continued, a truck pulled into the driveway. The group tensed, their instincts kicking in. Arthur stepped outside, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. But as the driver emerged, a wave of relief washed over him. It was Sheriff Daniels, the local lawman and a longtime friend of Arthur's. He stepped out of the truck, his hat tilted low over his brow, his expression serious. I heard about what happened last night, Daniels said, his voice steady. Figured I'd check in. Arthur nodded, shaking the sheriff's hand. Appreciate it, but we handled it. Daniels glanced at the house, noting the boarded-up windows and scattered debris. Looks like you did, but Razor and his gang aren't going to stop. I can post deputies out here for a while, but it might not be enough. Arthur's jaw tightened. We'll manage. Daniel studied him for a moment, then nodded. I know you will. Just be careful, Ace. You're not as young as you used to be. Arthur allowed himself a small smile. None of us are. As night fell, the group prepared for whatever might come next. They fortified their defenses, reviewed their plans, and settled into their positions. Arthur stood on the porch, his pistol resting on the railing, his gaze scanning the dark horizon. Bull joined him, his bat in hand. Think they'll come back tonight? Maybe, Arthur said. Maybe not, but if they do, we'll be ready. The chapter ends with the sound of distant engines, faint but growing louder. Arthur straightened, his grip tightening on the pistol. The fight wasn't over, but neither was his resolve. Together, they would face whatever came their way, and they wouldn't back down. The distant hum of engines grew louder, cutting through the stillness of the night. Arthur stood on the porch, his pistol gripped firmly in his hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Behind him, Bull, Sparky, and Doc took their positions, each man steeled for what was to come. The battle wasn't over, but tonight, they were more than ready. The motorcycles appeared in the distance, their headlights piercing the darkness. This time, Razor wasn't leading the pack alone. At least a dozen riders followed, their presence an unspoken declaration that they were here to finish what had been started. But Arthur wasn't afraid. His home, fortified with every ounce of ingenuity and courage he and his comrades could muster, stood as a symbol of their resilience. As the gang rolled to a stop just outside the yard, Razor dismounted, his movements sharp with anger. His men fanned out behind him, their weapons gleaming under the moonlight. The faint flicker of fear Arthur had seen in Razor the night before was gone, replaced by a simmering rage. "Grayson!" Razor shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "You think you've won? You've only made this worse for yourself." Arthur stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding. "You came to my home, Razor. You crossed the line. And now you're about to find out what happens when you underestimate people like us." The gang's laughter echoed in response, but it was forced, lacking the bravado of the night before. Arthur's quiet confidence was unsettling, a reminder that this wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for everything he stood for. The battle erupted with sudden ferocity. Razor's men charged toward the house, but the traps Sparky had set quickly turned their momentum into chaos. Cans tied to tripwires clanged loudly, disorienting the attackers. Floodlights flared to life, casting harsh beams across the yard. One of the outlaws stumbled into a hidden pit Arthur had dug earlier that day, cursing as he struggled to climb out. Bull emerged from the side of the house, his bat swinging with precision. He knocked one attacker off his feet, then turned to face another with a fierce determination. "I told you to stay off this property," he roared, his voice booming. Sparky, positioned near a back window, used his slingshot to hurl small, sharp projectiles at the gang, each hit sending a clear message. This was their ground, and it wasn't to be taken. Inside, Doc moved quickly and efficiently, ready to provide aid if needed. But tonight, his role wasn't just to heal, it was to defend. He had armed himself with a crowbar, and his steady hands made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to use it. Arthur remained on the porch, his pistol aimed steadily at Razor, who hung back, barking orders to his men. "Coward," Arthur muttered under his breath. He raised his voice. "Is this all you've got, Razor? Sending others to do your dirty work?" Razor's eyes blazed with fury. He drew a knife from his belt and stormed toward the porch. Arthur didn't flinch. He fired a warning shot into the ground at Razor's feet, stopping him in his tracks. "This ends now," Arthur said, his voice sharp with authority. "Leave or face the consequences." The tide began to turn. One by one, Razor's men fell back, overwhelmed by the veterans' defenses. Bull, Sparky, and Doc fought with the kind of precision and courage that could only come from years of experience. The gang's confidence crumbled as their numbers dwindled, and soon, the remaining outlaws were retreating to their motorcycles. But Razor refused to back down. He lunged at Arthur, his knife gleaming in the moonlight. Arthur sidestepped the attack, his movements deliberate and controlled. He brought the butt of his pistol down hard on Razor's hand, sending the knife clattering to the ground. "You're done, Razor," Arthur said, his voice low but firm. "It's over." Razor, breathing heavily, looked up at Arthur with a mix of rage and defeat. For a moment, he seemed ready to fight again, but the sound of sirens in the distance made him hesitate. The sheriff was coming, and Razor knew his time was up. He spat at the ground and muttered, "This isn't over, old man." Arthur didn't waver. "Yes, it is." As the gang fled into the night, the headlights of the sheriff's truck illuminated the yard. Sheriff Daniels stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered weapon as he surveyed the scene. "Looks like you handled things here," he said, a note of admiration in his voice. Arthur nodded. "We always do." The sheriff glanced at Razor, who sat slumped on the ground, his hands resting in his lap. "We'll take it from here," Daniels said, signaling to his deputies. Razor was handcuffed and loaded into the back of the truck, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The house was quiet once more. Arthur and his comrades sat around the kitchen table, the weight of the night settling over them. Bull leaned back in his chair, his bat resting against the wall. Sparky rubbed his sore shoulder, a tired grin on his face. Doc sipped his coffee, his calm demeanor unshaken. Arthur looked around at the men who had stood by his side, his heart swelling with gratitude. "We did it," he said simply. Bull raised his mug in a toast. "To us, and to anyone who dares to mess with us again." Laughter filled the room, a sound of relief and victory. They had faced overwhelming odds and emerged stronger for it. The chapter ends with Arthur stepping out onto the porch one last time. The night was quiet again, the stars shining brightly overhead. As he looked out over his property, a sense of peace washed over him. He had defended his home, his legacy, and the bonds that mattered most. This fight was over, but the lessons it taught him would last a lifetime. What we saw tonight was more than just a fight. It was a reminder that no matter how many battles we face, the true victory is in standing together. If this story moved you, remember, resilience, courage, and loyalty can overcome any challenge. If you believe in those values, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And make sure to activate the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this one. Stay strong and keep fighting for what matters most.